Hello again, and welcome to the final episode, the 26th, in our series on the Gospel of Mark. We're here again with Father Mike Lastiri, the Director of Worship for the Diocese of Fresno, and also Dr. Robert Maldonado from the Philosophy Department at California State University, Fresno. They've been with us all these many weeks, and we've taken you along a journey, bit by bit, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Today, in these 28 minutes, we hope to give you a capsule version, a walk-through that lets us see the highlights and the importance, the essence, the true heart of the Gospel of Mark, all in one single program. To begin, though, I think Father Mike and Robert deserve a chance to give us briefly their personal reasons why Mark should be studied and perhaps what they most personally like about this first gospel. Father Mike.
Thank you, Jim. I like Mark again for many reasons. Particularly, I think what we see on the surface is not necessarily what is there. I think as we do further study on Mark, as we get below all of the stories, the parables, the miracles, we see a deeper sense of the mission of Jesus. Mark gives us a particular look at what Jesus wanted to do and how he wanted to do it, which was going to be, it's going to be a little different than the presumptions we have. Certainly Sunday after Sunday, as people come to Mass in this particular cycle B, we hear the Gospels of Mark, it's very easy just to make certain assumptions, and assumptions people have held, assumptions a lot of my brother priests told and deacons as well. But to go a little deeper to see what was the real message, what was Jesus really doing, how does Mark, the earliest of the Gospels we have, in sometimes very short terms, one word, one short phrase, what is he trying to really tell us? And again, the mission of the church, if it should reflect Mark's idea of what Jesus is doing, should maybe give us pause to what we're doing today and maybe pause of what's going on, because it opens a new door for those who want to really study Mark deeper. And I think we saw that. We saw that in the sense of Jesus empowering others, empowering the most powerless, if you will, giving insights to moments, very much like the moments that we have today, and certainly the situation. And I think, and we talked about the way, if you will, that there is a journey. We're all on the journey, and in the Gospel of Mark, there is a journey. There is a journey that the mission takes. And it's the journey from the beginning public ministry to the moment of crucifixion. But how do we fit in the journey? What's the challenge of the journey for each of us in that same time?
What a great opening thought on our last program. Thanks, Father Mike. Robert, where would you like to just share why Mark is so important to you as a professor, as a believer?
Well, I guess it's similar to what Father Mike just said. I guess what I would add is that I'm always astonished by Mark. Mark is not what it seems to be. Mark, I think I said this at the beginning of the episode 3 or 1 or somewhere back at the beginning, but if Mark disappeared, we wouldn't lose a lot of content, because between Matthew and Luke, more than 90% of Mark is preserved. But I think we would lose an amazing amount, because Mark, it's not just the content, it's the way the story goes. It's how Mark puts it together. And I'm continually just astonished and amazed by Mark. It's an amazing gospel.
Well, it's been an amazing course that we hope we've shared with you. We have found it amazing. What I'd like to do is share 4 thoughts right now and then turn it over to Robert to walk us through something that Father Mike and I will chip in, but Robert has a direction he'd like to share with us. My 4 points are this. The goal of all the Gospels is not to tell us who Jesus was, but rather who the Christ is. It's so important to understand we're not doing a retroactive, we're not looking backwards. The Gospels are presenting who Jesus, who the Christ is. Second point, though it is that Mark is the first, he did have material with which he worked, and he worked with his own agenda. The Gospels have a direction in their narrative, which Robert will pick up in a moment. But what Mark does is write the Gospel with his own theological agenda, which was to share a proclamation that he had received, and therefore puts it in a line that deserves not to be broken up, or should not be broken up in pieces as many sermons, but rather a single narrative sermon. And finally, I'd like Robert to walk us through what he calls narrative analysis and how that is so well illustrated through the Gospel of Mark.
Well, Mark opens up Mark's story and invites the hearer, reader into it, and Mark does just amazing amounts of things to sort of get the reader involved in the story that Mark is telling us. And one of the ways I think of this is Mark has this famous breathless pace where it's going and bam, you're at the Jordan River, bam, Jesus is out in the wilderness, bam, he's in the synagogue exorcising demons. And it as hearer readers, we're caught up in it. I often think of as a kind of metaphor or analogy. When the mail would get picked up by the train, the trains wouldn't even stop. They would just have a hook and the bag of mail, and the train would go by and hook the mail into it. And I feel like we're that mail bag. Mark comes along and just takes us along. Last week we were talking about the end of the gospel with the failure of the women. And this breathless pace that Mark has been doing, Mark does consistently through the entire gospel, and then we get to the end, and it's almost like Keystone Cops or some kind of cartoon where a bicyclist, the bike stops, but we keep going. Mark stops the gospel so abruptly, and we cannot stop, and that too is part of Mark's genius, because as we said last week, the obligation is put on us. We've been carried along. We're participating. We're living it, and we move to continue Mark's message, to go tell the news that the women failed to tell, which of course is Mark's main message. You talked in your first point about the Christ who is. I mean, one of the things that's important about narrative and the experience of narrative is that it takes place in time, not just the time of the story, but the time we live with it. And so we are, as we're living with the story from the past in the present, it is now that we experience the characters in the gospel, especially Jesus.
Speaking of characters, what would you like to share with us about this major personality, this blind man of Bethsaida?
Well, Mark, as you may remember, has two famous blind man stories that frame that triple pattern from chapters 8 through 10 at the second half of the gospel. And the blind man of Bethsaida is only in Mark. It's a unique story. It's a very somewhat disturbing story because it takes Jesus twice to heal this man. My own view is that this blind man at Bethsaida is probably a composition of Mark's to symbolize the Markan reader-hearer, because what happens with this blind man is he sees, but not clearly. Things are out of whack, out of perspective. And then in the second stage of the miracle, he sees clearly. And that's pretty much what the experience of the entire gospel is. We wander along with Jesus and the disciples who are not getting it, to the point that Peter says Jesus is the Christ, which is the right answer. But then Peter doesn't understand that because he doesn't want Jesus to suffer. He rejects Jesus' understanding of what it means to be Christ. So Peter sees, but not clearly. He knows that Jesus is the Christ, but he doesn't fully understand what kind of Christ he is, and consequently what kind of Christian follower of Christ Peter needs to be. And then in the second half of the gospel.
So the next person after the blind man, which is really immediately following it in this, and immediately, which he says like 42 times, and immediately it's of, wait a minute, we just did one of those. He wants you to keep moving. he moves into Peter's confession. Father Mike, we put what do we call them, little quotations. Peter's confession is sort of like he doesn't get a good grade on this confession. And why do you think, in particular, after seeing Peter over and over, what does Peter miss?
Peter misses the link. Peter misses not only the mission, but he misses the whole intent. And for Peter, you know, we have a term, a confession in our Catholic theology is like we confess the sins. And basically it isn't that. It is really making a statement of faith, you know, saying this is what I believe. But Peter has a hard time with that because he may at times say I believe, but then we see he didn't catch it. He didn't know. He actually would become angry because it would be a rebuking. He would sometimes rebuke Jesus, whether he rebukes Jesus on the sea, whether he rebukes him after the moment in Philippi, Caesarea. All these places, there is that constant, almost hard and harsh dialogue. Because for Peter, he wants something, but he's not catching it. He doesn't know what to do with it, and actually then he just slips back constantly. And so Jesus challenges him constantly, all to the very end, because Peter is still the very last person of the apostle that's even mentioned by name. It is Peter who is sent, along with the others, to the empty tomb. Peter is that interesting figure, because for me, Peter is that figure which represents, I think, a lot of us in the moment. We desperately want to. We say yes, but then we say no, and then we get angry. We fall away, we fall into, we're swayed easily. And so he's that very interesting, that one personality throughout Mark, that he just comes in and goes out, comes in, goes, but it's never an easy dialogue, and it's never an easy relationship. And you can see that relationship it was never easy. But I think Mark has a reason for that, because relationships aren't easy. And the relationship means commitment, and how difficult commitments are.
Speaking of that, Robert, why don't you help us unpack a concept that you really are, really going to want to clarify, the triple. What is it, and how is it so important for Mark?
Well, remember the triple was the pattern that Mark uses in the second half of the gospel, where 3 times he repeats a threefold structure, namely that Jesus predicts his suffering, death, and resurrection. The disciples react to that prediction negatively, and then Jesus uses that opportunity of the disciples' misunderstanding to give a positive teaching on what it really means. And what's particularly interesting about that teaching that Jesus always gives in response to the negative reactions is that it tends to focus on alternative models of family, of discipleship. Fathers are out, masters are out. Women, children, and slaves are the models for Christians. And of course, one of the things that this marks Christians, and one of the things that this does, of course, is if you only use slave as a title and have no masters allowed in the community, that actually subverts the institution of the master and slave. The real problem is when you keep the institution of slavery in reality, and then use slave as a positive title of humility or something. So those things work badly together. I think Mark is actually imagining a really alternative social institution, namely not coercive power over, but shared family.
The idea of the structure of the gospel, it's something that cannot be missed. Some things are subtle, but when in chapter 8, then in chapter 9, and then in chapter 10, there is something that is replicated. And it has what Robert said, that same issue in 3 parts. It has to be important. And that's why we're putting it right there on the screen to remind us one last time of the urgency for us to appreciate the message that Mark puts at the middle of the gospel. It's also located in the middle, right at chapter 8, 9, and 10. We are in the middle of the program and need to take our break, but we'll be back to continue this walk through, which we've reached half point of the walkthrough. We'll be back for the second half right after the break. Stay tuned.
For over 25 years, KNXT has been serving the people of the San Joaquin Valley with good family television that's just not available anywhere else. It's important for you, the viewer, to help support this valuable tool of ministry. KNXT needs to continue to grow and bring you important programming about your faith. But sometimes it's hard to stop and find the time. Make it easy. Go to knxt.tv and find out how easy it is to support your Catholic television station, KNXT TV.
Welcome back to what will be the last 12 minutes, I guess, of our course on the Gospel of Mark. We're looking at the single read-through, the single journey through. We've looked at the blind man of Bethsaida. We looked at Peter's faux confession. And we've looked at the triple. I wonder if Robert could begin with what happens with Bartimaeus in chapter 10. Where are we going with this other blind man, Robert?
Well, again, just to reiterate how Mark is putting this together, Mark introduces the triple with a blind man story and concludes the triple with a blind man story. So these blind man stories frame the triple and thus are structurally really important. Bartimaeus is a blind man who's healed. In Mark, he's the preeminent symbol of the true Markan disciple of Jesus, because what he does is he sees and follows Jesus on the way. The way, of course, is the way of Christian discipleship, and where literally Jesus is going is Jerusalem, which of course is the place of his crucifixion and death. And so Bartimaeus sees and is willing to follow. So unlike others, he actually accepts the cost of discipleship and understands what it means to be the Christ, that he must suffer and die before he's raised.
Speaking of suffering and dying, the next character, the next personage that we might want to highlight on this journey through the narrative is the Roman centurion under the cross. What is the significance, Robert, here? You mentioned it in the last program, but once again.
Well, again, the centurion is the first human to identify Jesus as Son of God. Only God and the demons have been doing that. And so it's a remarkable moment. The person, again, Mark sets it up so that the person you'd expect to get it doesn't, and the one you would expect not to get it does. Here is the centurion who's in charge of Jesus' execution, is the one who is the first to identify him as Son of God. And of course, this comes back all the way to the blind man at Bethsaida, because just as the blind man at Bethsaida didn't see clearly in the first half of the miracle, the first stage, the second half of the second attempt of Jesus gets him to see clearly. Just as Peter didn't see clearly that Jesus was the suffering servant Christ, so too the reader doesn't quite know where that's going. And so as readers, we finish the gospel and we're there with the centurion, seeing, like Bartimaeus, like the centurion, clearly, so that the blind man at Bethsaida, the first story, sort of encapsulates the reader's experience, or the proper reader's experience of coming to a full sight, namely seeing clearly what the true nature of Jesus is as it's revealed on the cross.
Now what's very interesting, because if that was in 1539, the centurion, at 16:8, the final verse of the authentic Gospel of Mark, we have the failure of the women to tell the news of Jesus' rising. Now, what is the impact of that? And I think you've already said it, but now we have it in print to prove that it's right. What is the importance of 16:8 when the women fail?
Well, as I said, as you know, we're propelled by Mark into the future, which of course is our present future. and we must go tell because we see the failure as a failure. If you see it as a failure, you know it was wrong. That puts an obligation on you to do the right thing. And of course, the important thing is to tell the truth. Namely, not that Jesus is about power and privilege and perks and exercising power over other people, but that the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for others. So the real good news must be told.
There it is, our obligation to tell the real good news of the true suffering servant Christ, not Peter's version. Now, is there the thought that maybe why Mark is writing this is that there were contemporaneously actually alternative visions, so that though he's the first gospel, he's not the first one with a vision of how the church should be? So unpack maybe a little bit, maybe Father Mike helps us on this. In the early community, though Mark is the first gospel, he's also playing catch-up on other stuff going on already. True or not?
I wouldn't quite say catch-up because it really is contemporary. Mark is reacting. We know from Colossians and Ephesians that churches were following some teachings of Paul and taking them further and inscribing the masters over slaves, fathers over children, husbands over wives, Greco-Roman family values, and using those as models for the church. Mark seems to be casting Peter and the disciples as symbols of those kinds of Christians who want the Greek-Roman way of doing the family and politics and rejecting it. Mark provides an alternative model of a fatherless family and a discipleship of committed sharers of power.
I think we have a slide that in one single picture gives us that, what Robert just said, and then that becomes the springboard, I think, for Father Mike. The Gospel of Mark offers deliberately an alternative model. Father Mike, you did have something that wanted to say, right now, Mark's Gospel is very relevant to the church. You want to unpack that?
It's important to note, I think, as this show is airing, that we are in what is called forth by Pope Benedict to be the year of faith. And in this year of faith, the Holy Father is challenging us all to go back to the documents of the Second Vatican Council. Once again, look at those documents, study those documents again. What were those documents telling us? Because it was a profoundly different council than all of its prior 20 councils. What Vatican II did, uncommon for the church, was it never ended any of its documents with, believe this or else, but rather said, think about this and pray. And so the church did not come heavy-handed to say, this is the way we're going to do business, this is what you're going to believe, but rather we want you to think, whether it was church in the world, while it was about Scripture, whether it was all of the wonderful things that the church was grappling with in the 60s and actually many years prior. So he wanted a fresh look, and one of the ways to look at a fresh look was to go back. And one of the things that it did is it went back to the Gospels. And it wanted us to unpack the Gospels in a whole new way, especially after Pope Pius XII had told the theologians that they could now break open that Scripture in that wonderful encyclical in the early 40s. And so therefore, we started talking about new ways of governance. We talked about new ways of sharing charisms. Women religious were told to seek new ways of ministering in the church. We heard a call that the people of God were all of those baptized, not into a pyramid type of hierarchy, but rather all of us working, certainly with the Holy Father as the head of the church, the teaching college of bishops, and then all of us together, but we were all the people of God. So it was asking us to look back, and if you look at Mark really sets up this entire way of mission. as the council was encouraging us to look future to the mission, to kind of scrap what had become heavy hierarchical and very structural, to know that there were new ways of doing ministry, that all people baptized had an important part of the mission, that everyone was involved in the work of the church, that the parish work was not just the work of priests and sisters, but it's the work of all. So we saw lay ministries, ecclesial lay leaders begin to emerge. And if you look at what's going on in many parts of our country, but also in our world, we have men and women standing up doing their rightful roles in the church. And I think when you go back and look at Mark, who saw oppression, Mark, who saw the difficulties of living under horrible situations, and the mission of Jesus, as he shows us, the way, was for a whole different, an alternative. There is another way to serve and to be, if you will, as we use it, to be Christ in the world today. And I think in this year of faith, we're all called to restudy those fantastic documents and to maybe question and ask ourselves, am I being faithful to the way of discipleship of Jesus, as Mark had challenged his own people and challenges us today?
Robert, we have like 2 minutes. Final thoughts?
Well, I think Vatican II was fairly prophetic in terms of its focus on Mark. I mean, it was rather explicit that Mark was something that the church needed to read more carefully, not just in the sort of cycling of the Gospels and the lectionary, but in the suffering servant image of Christ. And as Father Mike said, the kind of excessive hierarchy, triumphalism, imperialism of the church, that rather that Mark had something that had not been picked up well by the church. And Vatican II, I think, actually recognized that and then said we've got to include these texts because they haven't been read as carefully as they might have been. I think they took, historically, well, Mark doesn't add much. Let's focus on Matthew and maybe some John. And now we're recognizing, partly as a result of Vatican II, what Mark can offer us.
I have to thank so much Father Mike Lastiri and Dr. Robert Maldonado for the 26 weeks that they have shared. It's a whole year's work is what they gave us. I want to thank them for what they're doing in their professional lives, what they're doing as our Director of Worship. I also want to challenge all of us to not just enjoy this course, 26 episodes, but to really pray over it and to make it perhaps our leitmotif for how we would be doing our 50th anniversary of the Vatican Council. We start reading the Gospel of Mark because of Vatican II. We always used to read from Matthew week after week. Now this cyclical possibility opens up the reality of reading about at least a third of Mark does get read during year B. I want to thank you for being here and hope that you'll continue reading Mark long after this course is over. God bless.